Okay, so the big topic we're talking about here is ecological services. It's got a lot of attention, sort of, at least in our Department of Agriculture and in our society over the last few years. Mark's going to talk on some particular very interesting sort of practices that can sort of bring both farming income together and providing comparative services to the public. All sorts of good things. I'm going to start off with kind of more of a bigger overview of how we kind of analyze this stuff within our department and some of the policy instruments that we're looking at to try and enhance these. Well, I also did want to mention we've had a little bit of interaction with the RCEM over the last few years, very little, but we are interested in developing that further. We're quite happy to be supporting the network at the conference this year. And as you'll see towards the end of my presentation anyway, some of the directions that our research is leading to, I think, lead to more developed relationships with groups such as yourselves. So, how do I, it's just down, 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 up and down. There we go. Just a quick outline. What I'm going to do is going to sort of outline why Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has been looking at ecological services policy over the last few years. What are some of the lessons we've learned, and but what it's led into in terms of tough questions in the future. This graph is drawn from an OECD framework that we've kind of adopted to use on something in Europe they call multifunctionality. It's the idea that agriculture produces not only kind of market outputs that we eat and feed and industrial uses like clothing, cotton, and whatnot, but it also, in addition to kind of market outputs, it produces non-market things. Economists will call these externalities or public goods. And those things, they can be good stuff or they can be bad stuff, essentially. Some of the positive outputs of agricultural activity can include providing biodiversity, landscape values, cultural and heritage values, rural development, food security, and sometimes flood protection. There are a whole host of other services that can be provided by agriculture. But of course, there's some of that bad stuff too. Pollution, you get too much nitrogen or phosphorus in the water, you get routine algae outbreaks like we've had in eastern Canada, you get dirty water, landscape destruction, there are a whole bunch of greenhouse gas. The greenhouse gases can go both ways, actually. Some agricultural activities sink greenhouse gases and reduce emissions, some of them lead to more emissions. So you get these sort of positive and negative impacts. And of course, the private market sort of takes care of most of the market outputs, but on the other side, the problem is there's no kind of market signals. Nobody's paying producers to do more of the good stuff, and nobody's generally penalizing them for doing less of doing more of the bad stuff, or rewarding them for doing less of the bad stuff. And so that's our policy focus has been to try to kind of connect, to do the same thing we do with a market, but somehow connecting these negative and particularly the positive impacts back to producers to get them to be doing things that will provide these things to the public. If the really sweet spot, what's really good, and actually what Mark's going to be talking about more, is when the positive things can also be positive for a producer from a financial point of view. So if there are practices that are profitable for a producer and also provide all sorts of nice benefits for the public, that's really great, and we're going to be talking about how that fits into the other policy mix. Sometimes another one of the complications here is that what's positive and what's negative, sometimes it's hard to draw the line, because something like an activity that would provide, I don't know, you switch to no-till agriculture, you might be putting less silt into the water, but then you might be also raising pesticide risk because you're using more pesticides. Or there are a number of other activities where they have kind of mixed effects. Other things also, since traditionally producers haven't been there's been no signal, reward, or penalty for something like putting nitrogen or phosphorus into the water. It trickles in very small amounts, and it only becomes a problem much farther downstream. So it's very hard to tell who put which kilogram of phosphorus into Lake Winnipeg and trace it back to a producer. So that distinguishing where the positive and the negative are is kind of difficult sometimes. And that's actually one of the key issues in this area, is something we call reference levels. It's just kind of a bit like property rights. Where do you draw the line between what the kind of activity the producer sort of owes it to society, just in terms of maintaining stewardship, and where they should be sort of rewarded for going beyond some kind of a minimum level of stewardship, and maybe deserve some kind of a reward. Just one of my only pictures in my presentation is this. Just a first big point: foreign policies do have a really big impact on the environment, on land use. This is a picture of the Alberta-Montana border, and that's going through the middle is the Milk River. It's taken with an infrared satellite image, and essentially the dark areas and the reddish areas are ones where the heavy vegetative cover, either brush, prairie, native prairie, or woodland. The lighter areas, if you get up close to the picture, you'll see that these are all strips of mainly wheat being grown on plots. And essentially, and that line in the middle is the border, right? And that's not because the weather changes at the border. Right? What changes at the border is the policies, because in the United States they have a fairly different set of agricultural policies which tend to favor particular annual crops: wheat, soya, corn, cotton. Whereas in Canada, our agricultural policies are what we call decoupled. They support farm income, but they don't support one commodity over another. So what happens in this area, and the flip side of that in the United States, is they don't give any support to their cattle industry or their hog industry. So what it does is it tends to skew the land use into plowing up and growing wheat, and whereas most of the land on the Canadian side is used for grazing, we're not subsidizing the annual crops. So you have literally people are driving their combines right up to the border, and they turn around and they drive back the other way, because that's what we get paid for. And on our side, they're grazing cattle. And there are some areas in here of more intensive irrigated land use, but totally different land uses because of the policies. You can see on this side of the border, you're going to get a lot more in terms of public services. This is soaking up a lot more carbon than the plowed soil, providing a lot of cover for native species, for wildlife habitat, much better water quality in the river as well. Because the river, if you're plowing right up close to the river, of course, you end up with a lot of silt and nutrients getting into it. So it's in some ways it's a good news story. I mean, we try to do some things better than some other countries. This is actually this skew that you find in the United States towards annual crop production is also present in a lot of other countries. Europe does a very similar kind of thing. So I mean, these policies, they do have a big impact on the environment, and there are some things going on that we do have. So it's kind of important to take a big picture view and think these things through. Because you do, I mean, when they put these policies in place, they weren't trying to pollute. They were just trying to help the farmers, but sort of inadvertently over the years, sometimes you try to do one thing and you end up causing other problems. So, anyways, in this kind of context, the sort of political situation is that producer groups they would like to be compensated for these environmental services that they provide, and they've been getting somewhat strident over the last few years, asking for kind of once in a month, want to be paid for this stuff. Provincial governments, federal government to a large extent as well, kind of leery of this stuff. They see it as very costly because if we were to pay for every little thing that everybody does, you could be looking at billions of dollars. They got all these deficits. The Treasury boards in all the provinces are kind of worried about this stuff. There's already a fair bit of agricultural in financial support going to the agricultural industries. Some people will say, well, why do we don't have to give more? Should be giving more, and it can cause some inequity with other landowners, because if you're going to compensate farmers for doing certain things, well, why don't you compensate also woodlot owners, golf courses, other recreational landowners? Maybe everybody should be giving. So then the bill gets even bigger, and of course your friends over at Treasury Board, they get even more worried. Right? So there's a kind of compromise about 4 or 5 years ago. The federal provincial ministers of agriculture decided that this was important enough to do a lot of research on, but they didn't want to commit to any particular big option of how to deal with it. So that's sort of what that led to. We had a bunch of essentially research and consultative things that we've done in the last 5 years. We had a big symposium in Winnipeg in 2006. We ran 8 pilot projects that we just completed last year for several $1 million. It's over $3 million, so it's not peanuts. It's a fair bit of work. We looked at what other countries are doing, international examples, and we did a bunch of other policy research looking at the Canadian situation, in terms of particularly looking at there's costs of regulation, how do you set these reference levels between what somebody owes, kind of what somebody should do, and what they should be compensated for. We looked at tax credits, easements, tradable development rights, various different ways of trying to integrate and connect producers with the benefits that society is looking for. We also did a big cost-benefit analysis. And I'll sort of talk of some of the results that have come out of all this research. First, I guess I could just quickly go over the 8 pilot projects we did. Prince Edward Island, we did one, that was one of the original provinces that was quite keen on this stuff. We looked at using annual payments and also looked at something called BMP insurance, which is kind of an insurance scheme to get people to, and I'll talk about that a bit more. That's quite intriguing. In Nova Scotia, we looked at a kind of a watershed. That was the key thing there was trying to see how we could figure out how to get different stakeholders in the watershed. There were kind of professional, large-scale farmers. There were some kind of hobby farmers, which have somewhat different interests, and there were other landowners who were non-farmers. And it was to try to create a consensus in a small watershed on how to manage problems there. And the third one was actually based in New Brunswick. It was looking at using something we call the environmental farm plan and see if we could add an ecological service component to that program, since that program is something that's already running right across the country and fairly well liked by producers. The fourth one, Bassin des Rochers, was in the South Shore of Quebec. It's an area where there was excess phosphorus loading in the water, and they were looking at partly testing physical ways of fixing the banks of the river to reduce the phosphorus loads, but at the same time looking at trying to use kind of peer pressure if they provide rewards to the community if everybody on the river sort of participates in a program, but sort of reduce benefits if everybody's not in. So try to way to see if we can use community pressure a bit. Eco-resources was a project to look at agroforestry, also was done in Quebec, some of the benefits there. Manitoba, ALICE pilot, some of you might have heard of ALICE. It's an alternate land use services, is an acronym that's used largely by some of the agricultural groups to promote policies that provide these services. To a large extent, they're trying to get annual payments for services, but we've been working cooperatively with them. They've got several provincial kind of level pilots going that are trying to push at this from the producer side. Ducks Unlimited Canada we did a project they were kind of modeling wetlands in a particular area in southern Manitoba, and then looking at how auctions could be used based on that data to increase the level of services. And in Saskatchewan, the Lower Souris River, it was trying to look at the wildlife habitat in a certain area, and then sort of at the community level trying to figure out okay, how much is enough. Like there was a consensus they didn't quite have enough habitat protected. They thought they should get more, but there's this question of like how much is enough, and how do you create a consensus among all the landowners, and then what's a fair way to get to that kind of a target, because these things they get a bit subtle.